Hello, you are listening to another edition of the Korea Pod. My name is Henry Shin. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you receive podcasts. It does help us to get the word out, and we definitely do appreciate the support. Well, we're going to be talking about an issue that if you live in Korea and you are looking for a decent place to live, especially in Seoul, it is a huge, huge concern for you, and that is finding affordable, decent housing. Now, everyone says that Korea is one of the more expensive places to live in the world, and that's certainly true. If you look at various rankings, Seoul is often in the top 10 in terms of most expensive places to live. And the main reason why that is, and it really is the same reason why it would be in places like New York, or San Francisco, or Tokyo, and that is the cost of housing. Now, Seoul specifically has always been a place that is quite a bit more expensive to live and to buy a place or rent a place because it is a highly dense city. There's not a lot of space to build out new houses, and quite frankly, everyone wants to live in here, and there's just a lot more demand than there is present supply, and that's why you've seen prices always be above the relative cost of housing throughout the rest of the country. In fact, if you go into the countryside, in the rural areas, it is quite a bit more affordable, and a lot of people say actually the real estate markets in a lot of those places are struggling because they are just, quite frankly, not attractive markets to live in. So that's always been the case for probably as long as most people have remembered living here in the city. However, recently, it has just completely gone bonkers. The prices in the past few months have risen at a rate that nobody will say is a rational market behavior in terms of the rate of increase, the amount of increase. We're talking about houses that used to be, let's say, $500,000 US, now being priced at $800,000 US in just a matter of months. And so, yeah, it's crazy. It's worried a lot of people, especially people who have been looking to purchase a place to live in Seoul. It's worried a lot of people wondering about the future of their kids and whether they can eventually find a place to upgrade if they live in a smaller place and they're looking to move more upmarket. It just really has put sort of a stranglehold on people who want to simply buy a place to live in, not the investor class. And we're going to get to why there's been a bit of a controversy, a bit of a backlash, and a bit of resentment to these so-called real estate speculators who've been sort of running rampant in the market, accused of driving up the prices for their own benefit, and at the same time, basically pushing everyone else out who would legitimately want to live in a decent, affordable place, giving those people no good options. So with this market, the way it stands, and how the prices have been going so crazy, and how the general consensus is, this is not a good thing for society. It's not a good thing long-term for the economy. If you don't have an affordable place to live in the city, in the political, social, economic capital of the country in Seoul, that does not make it for a conducive and harmonious societal environment for people to live in. And it'll affect a lot of things like the happiness index, social cohesion, and a lot of the factors that would rate Seoul as a livable city. So the government is mindful of this. They are quite aware that the people are, quite frankly, pissed off at the situation, and they've been pressured to make some dramatic moves. Now, this current government, the Moon Jae-in government, has already put into place several real estate initiatives to try and cool down the market. And up till now, nothing has worked. So this recent period where I'm talking about the last few months where the prices have just skyrocketed, in some places going up a few 100 million won in value in just a few months, they decided they're going to have to do something very dramatic, and it involved as a central tool, a key tool, the use of what's known as the 종합 부동산세, or the comprehensive real estate tax, known colloquially in Korean as the 종부세, and they have decided to hike that rate quite dramatically. So, in a nutshell, as to what the government has proposed, and some of this stuff is pretty technical, it's a little bit complicated, but what they announced is that if you are owning multiple properties in these so-called speculative areas, these are areas that the government has designated as districts that are ripe for speculative behavior or abuse of the real estate system. If you own properties in that area, you could face real estate taxes as high as 3.2%. And that's higher than the peak of this kind of comprehensive real estate tax that was imposed during the former Roh Moo-hyun administration. So 3.2% is an unprecedented rate. And also, you would have additional penalties if your house is of a certain threshold or penalty. So if you own houses or several houses that are worth over 600 million won, 900 million won, 1.2 billion won, you will get corresponding rate hike increases in the taxes that you would owe. And those have all been bumped up across the board. They're trying to make it as progressive a tax as possible. So on the lowest level, if you have a house worth about, let's say, 300 million won, over 300, it'll be from a 0.2 to 0.7% hike, half percentage point hike, but relatively manageable, I would say, for that level. If it's 600 million won, it would be hiked from 2% to 2.5%, another half a percentage hike. But it is, when you get into the upper levels, the 900 million won levels, then you will see the hikes increase to above the 3% threshold. Now, that's dealing with the real estate taxes that would be imposed depending on if you own multiple properties, depending on the value of the properties that you own. But there are also going to be tightened restrictions on the loans you can receive. So in a nutshell, what they're trying to clamp down is on real estate speculation. So if you happen to be an owner of multiple properties, you're basically, I think the simplest way to think of it is you're no longer going to be able to get a mortgage. You're not going to be able to finance any additional real estate purchases. In the past, you would be able to kind of leverage your existing houses as collateral and get loans and start buying more properties, which of course entails that the rich get richer because the more capital you have, the more leverage you have to wield that capital to acquire more capital. And that kind of turned into a vicious cycle. So they're nipping that in the bud. If you own multiple properties, especially if you are looking to buy into these so-called speculative areas, which basically encompass the entirety of Seoul, as well as Sejong City and certain other pockets of the country, these sort of hot kind of speculative markets, you won't be eligible to receive mortgage loans. And on the flip side of that, they are going to try to make it easier for those who are non-homeowners and who would like to buy into the market. They're going to try to loosen lending restrictions for them. However, if you are, again, trying to buy some of these higher priced properties and you have been real estate owners, you're going to have to also look at LTV ratios, the loan to value ratios. You would, in the past, be able to maybe borrow up to 60% of the property. That is no longer the case. That's going to drop down to 40%. And also, if you are somebody who is wanting to purchase another house in addition to the ones you have, in addition to the taxes, in addition to the tightened loan restrictions, you are also going to be under much more scrutiny overall from the government as to what you can do in terms of registering your properties. A lot of shady business practices have occurred when people would try to register the properties that they actually bought with their own money, or that they are actually the ones who are investing under, let's say, family members' names or using other entities or other business fronts to try and hide this to reduce their tax liability. So that's another factor in place here. Now, the government will further announce more plans at the time of this taping. They haven't actually officially announced it, but in conjunction with these more punitive measures, taxation hikes and restrictions on lending for multiple homeowners, they are also planning to announce a dramatic increase in housing supply, especially affordable housing within some of these more prime areas, at least in the Seoul region and the surrounding sort of satellite suburban regions of Seoul. So that plan is set to be announced shortly. We're looking at numbers of 300,000 new units of housing planned to be built. We'll have to see the specifics on where exactly they're going to build those houses, how they're going to try to build those houses, and what kind of price points they're going to be trying to offer for people who can't afford housing as it stands right now. So it's sort of a two-track scheme, kind of. On the one hand, you can say punish those speculators, or on the other hand, deter people who are trying to manipulate the real estate market with these taxation and loan restriction schemes. And on the other hand, try to give a leg up or a helping hand to the people who can't afford houses right now by upping the supply of affordable housing units and try to make it easier and develop some other programs to allow these people who otherwise would not afford houses to have the opportunity to do so, depending on their income levels and what threshold that they would be eligible for such programs. So at the end of the day, the question will be, will these measures finally work? Will it actually cool down the market? And it's pretty interesting because you're getting really a diverse array of opinions and reactions to this. So the typical conservative reaction to this is BS. This is just what in the Korean media they're calling a tax bomb. The conservatives say that they're punishing people for working hard and buying houses and giving them these huge tax hikes, even if they aren't engaging in speculative behavior. They're talking about this as a big tax increase on the innocent middle class who worked hard to buy a house, and just because it happens to be in a wealthier area or an area where their real estate has appreciated quite dramatically, they're going to have to pay additional taxes, and that's just simply a punitive measure that's unfair. Now, there's been subsequent reporting or rebuttals to that argument saying that the actual tax burden on those kind of specific cases would be nominal at best. We're talking maybe an additional 1 million won of tax, which is, I'm not trying to say that's insignificant, but the way it's been portrayed by the conservatives is that it's just this huge kind of devastating tax that would bankrupt people. But if you are in the middle class and you have a house that's in a relatively decently priced price point, you're probably not going to pay too much extra in tax. What they're targeting are, and what they're saying is these houses that are worth over 900 million won, which would get the most punitive measures. That accounts for basically 1% of all the real estate in this country, and it would affect approximately about 1% of the households in this country, mostly centered in the Seoul area. So we're talking about, basically, if you talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement, it would largely not affect drastically or negatively the 99%, but it would affect the so-called 1%. And I guess with a taxation scheme that is deemed progressive, that would be the goal to do so. Now, the other flip side of the argument is whether the problem and what the root cause of this is. Is this a problem of the wealthy gaming the system, the people who have access to capital, hoarding more capital and engaging in these speculative schemes and therefore unfairly manipulating the market to raise these values at this unsustainable price? Is that the root cause of the problem? And a lot of people say that the government seems to be approaching it that way. Or is the root cause of the problem a simple matter of supply and demand? Is it a problem of there are a certain number of units up for sale at a given time in this city, and there are an even greater number of people wanting to move in or purchase or live in units within the city? So then if that is the inherent imbalance where the supply is not meeting demand, people are saying you can put whatever measures or punitive taxation schemes into the system that you want, but if you don't fundamentally address the issue of supply meeting that demand, you're always going to have that imbalance. And naturally, that supply and demand imbalance, it's just basic economics 101. If demand exceeds supply, then the price will go up. And so it might have sort of a dampening effect. I think a lot of people agree that these new measures are harsh enough that you will see at least the prices level off, at least in the near term. But for the long term, if the issue of supply and demand is not met, if you're not dramatically building a lot more units to satisfy that demand, the long-term trend for these housing prices is going to be always going up unless something is fundamentally done to achieve it. Now, whether that is going to be feasible with this housing scheme that they announced to drastically increase the number of affordable housing units, we'll have to see. But I think there is a certain group of analysts or pundits that say whatever the government proposes with increasing that supply of affordable housing is not going to be enough to make a dent in this pent-up demand that is still here. Because what they're saying is everybody who wants to move into Seoul hasn't been able to do so. And we're talking about the millions of people who actually still work in this city, whether you work for a company or government institution or an educational institution. A lot of people work in the city, but they have to live outside the city just because they can't afford decent housing within the city borders. So those demographics are not being served by this necessarily. Now, that is sort of the question of where these houses will be built. This government plan to increase the supply. If it's going to be all built in sort of the satellite areas, the Gyeonggi regions where they are on the outskirts of Seoul, that might not be attractive enough to, let's say, boost the demand, satisfy the demand so that the prices would plateau or level off. I think the basic consensus is, regardless of what's going on with the new tax measures, with the tightened monetary lending restrictions for buying additional properties, and with the idea of introducing more housing units, whether it's kind of going through the greenbelt zones, which has met with some resistance, or trying to build out more units within areas that may not be as developed within the city, that might help in the short term. It might even help stabilize some of the prices in the midterm, but that's not going to address that chronic issue of this over demand and under supply. And so worst case scenario is the prices will stabilize and you won't really see much happen until the prices then go up again after this sort of lull in the market. And so then the fundamental question that doesn't get addressed is, what is the imbalance? The imbalance is the supply of houses not meeting the demand, and therefore demand exceeding supply, and prices have to go up. And of course, you mix in all the speculative behavior and sort of these other accusations of people colluding. There are apartment groups that have been accused of colluding to keep their prices high, banning real estate agencies from listing units in their apartment complex that might be too low for their standards. And that's been ruled to be a very, very unsavory, immoral practice. And the government's warning that they might crack down on that. But the fundamental imbalance, not just with supply and demand and the speculative behavior by certain unscrupulous real estate owners, is the fact that Seoul is the center of the Korean universe. And that imbalance is not going to be addressed anytime soon. It's the capital. It's still the political power. It's still the economic power of the entire country. And wherever you are in the country, if you want to, I suppose, make it big, so to speak, in this country, you're going to have to move to Seoul. And there have been efforts to move some of the administrative capitals, departments to Sejong City, which is sort of now trying to fashion itself as the administrative center of the country. But that's a painstaking process. There's a lot of resistance to civil servants and government officials to move to Sejong City, although Sejong City has now become a very speculative area because of the fact that it does house a lot of these government institutions. But it doesn't address all of the other imbalances that occur with Seoul and the rest of Gyeonggi province, and even Gyeonggi province compared to Gangwon province or Chungcheong province or Jeolla province or Gyeongsang province. So there are a lot of issues that still need to be addressed in terms of imbalance. Supply and demand of houses, curbing speculative behavior, the imbalance between how the rich behave and how the poor are basically locked out of the system, and then the overall imbalance of the country where everything is centered in this one plot of land surrounding Seoul. And basically, there's nothing that anyone can do to address that issue unless you start having other hubs and centers of culture in other places, centers of commerce in other places, centers of innovation in other places. There have been attempts. They've all failed. And that is going to be the dilemma going forward. And my frank opinion is, unless that changes, nothing else will really change in terms of the real estate if you look at it from a 10 or 20 year period. It's not great news, but the government is doing their best to try to alleviate the situation, at least in the short term. All right, that's going to do it for us. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back with another edition of the Korea Pod very shortly. Thanks for listening. My name is Henry Shin. Goodbye.